Welcome to the next installment of Sages of the Ages. This is our five-part series in which we are going to explore the life and legacy of five outstanding Torah personalities, mostly from the 16th century. Tonight we're going to talk about Rav Yosef Karo, and we will immediately identify him also by the other terms by which he's colloquially known. He is most famous as the author of the Shulchan Aruch, which we'll explore shortly, and therefore he's known as the Mechaber very often, because we'll speak next week about the Ramah, who was the collaborator, the Ashkenazi collaborator with Rav Yosef Karo on the Shulchan Aruch. And we speak of the Ramah, or the Haggah, which is glass, or the Mapah, which is a tablecloth. And the Shulchan Aruch, which means a set table, was written by Rav Yosef Karo, and he is sometimes called the Mechaber, the author. He's also known as Beit Yosef, and we'll talk about why that may be. And lastly, he's known most reverentially as Maran, Maran Beit Yosef. Maran means our master, our teacher. And especially in the Sephardic world, even to this day, hundreds of years later, when one says Maran, although you can sometimes use it for a more contemporary personality, but if someone says Maran, this is the view of Maran, it means Rav Yosef Karo. The name Karo is spelled in Hebrew Kuf Aleph Resh Vav. In English, it's sometimes spelled with a K or sometimes with a C, Karo. So we'll take it from the top of the handout that you have here, and we'll elaborate as we go along. Just to mention that the pages you have in your hands are three sides of a page. We have that image of Rabbi Yosef Karo, which may or may not be visible. Some of the copies are actually too dark. These are a bit nicer if you want to trade up. The second page is Rav Moshe Isserlis, and I deliberately linked them together for reasons that will become apparent perhaps next week, more so than tonight. And then we have also a couple of facsimiles, some images from the Shulchan Aruch and also from the Mishnah, and we'll talk about those as we go along. Rav Yosef Karo was born in 1488 in Toledo, in Spain, which means that as a child of 4 years old, he was driven into exile. His father was called Rav Ephraim. His father was a distinguished rabbi. His uncle as well was also distinguished. His uncle was called Rav Yitzchak Karo. And Rav Yosef Karo, as I said, as a boy, fled with his family from Spain to Portugal. Most of the Jews who were driven from Spain, we mentioned last week when we spoke about Abarbanel, we spoke quite a lot about the Spanish emigres. The largest number just hit the road and they traveled west to Portugal. And that's what he did, especially those who were poor. They went just to Portugal, and it seemed to be the best option. It wasn't that far away, and as I said, one could get there on 2 feet. But the party did not last long. Actually, there was no party from the very beginning. It was desperate, even when they first crossed the border. But within 5 years, they were on the road again. They were driven into exile by Portugal. We discussed that last week a little bit as well. So again, as a boy, he was once more on the road. It seems that he went with his family first to Morocco, perhaps for a short while, and finally, and that was the whole rest of his life, nearly all of the rest of his life was in the Ottoman Empire. And he made his way to Constantinople and elsewhere, as we shall see. Just to take it again from the top, so he was born in Toledo. He died in Tzfat, in Eretz Yisrael. I think around the room, probably many of us, maybe all of us, have been to Tzfat and have been to his kever. His gravesite in Tzfat, in the famous cemetery in Tzfat, is one of the most visited graves in the Jewish world, for reasons that I think will become apparent as we go along. But not only his grave, but also his synagogue, the Beit Knesset of Rav Yosef Karo, the Beit Yosef, also still stands. And there is a legend. I mean, it's part fact and maybe some legendary embellishment as well. There was a devastating earthquake in Tzfat in 1837. It devastated the entire region, and Tzfat itself was almost entirely destroyed. Maybe 6,000 to 7,000 people, probably most of them Jews, were buried literally in that earthquake. because Tzfat is built on a hillside, on a mountain top even, and the houses were constructed in such a way that the roof of one house was the street above, and so it was terraced in that way. And when the earth shook, the buildings collapsed, and most of the synagogues were destroyed, most of the homes were destroyed, and I say a great many of the residents lost their lives. The only building that was intact, or the only synagogue that was intact, was the synagogue of the Beit Yosef. And one wall of that remained standing, and they say those who were in that the synagogue were saved from the earthquake. So as I say, it's maybe embellished a bit by the legend, but the earthquake itself is definitely factual, and all of the synagogues were rebuilt after then. The only synagogue that still remains, is the one wall of the Beit Yosef synagogue of Yosef Karo. And then again, just to finish, so he was popularly known as Beit Yosef and Shulchan Aruch for his major works, also known as the Mechaber, the author, and he was a Talmudist and a great codifier of halacha. As I said, his synagogue and his kever remain shrines in the Jewish world even to this day. You can see from the mathematics very easily. He lived a very long life. He lived to the age of 87. He had an exceptionally accomplished life as well. And we will hopefully have the chance in the next 45 minutes or so together to learn more about him. So, as again taken from the top, the great explosion of Spanish Jewry, so he fled to Spain and to Portugal, possibly to Morocco, and then to Nikopol, which was Bulgaria. And that's where he finally settled for a number of years, and that's where his own Jewish and scholarly growth began, where he studied with his father. Eventually, the family settled in Constantinople, which is Turkey. He gained repute as an eminent Talmudist, even as a young man. In fact, there is evidence that he wrote one of his most important works, Kesef Mishnah, as a young man. I'll tell you about it since I mentioned it right now. So Kesef Mishnah is a commentary on the Mishnah Torah. Although he wrote it as a young man, it was published last. It was published after the Beit Yosef and after the Shulchan Aruch. So he published it only towards the end of his life, but it seems that he wrote it as a young man. I have here one of the volumes of the Mishnah Torah. This is the full set of Mishnah Torah here. And Kesef Mishnah is a commentary, a very extensive commentary on the Mishnah Torah of the Rambam, and it is published in all the standard editions of the Mishnah Torah. His style is to provide the sources for the Rambam, which the Rambam himself did not provide. So the Kesef Mishnah provides the Talmudic background, and he explains the view of the Rambam. He also defends the Rambam against the animadversions. Do you remember who we said is the great critic of the Rambam? For those who were with us in the summer. The Ravid, that's right. The Ravid is the great critic, the Baal HaSagos, and the Kesef Mishnah sets as his task to defend the Rambam against the critiques of the Ravid, as well as much more. And the Kesef Mishnah is a very important and classic commentary on the Mishnah Torah even to this day. As I said, it's interesting that it was published, however, last. He began at the age of 24 to write at the age of 34, to undertake his great work of the Beit Yosef. The Beit Yosef is his commentary on the Torah. And again, I want to refer to those who were with us last term. We spoke about Rav Yaakov ben Harash, Yaakov ben Ashibal Haturin, and the Beit Yosef wrote the commentary, as I say, which is known as Beit Yosef, which you can see here. So this is also about, I think about 10 volumes, large volumes as you can see. And in fact, the four pillars, the four volumes of the Shulchan Aruch really derive their names from the Torah. And for those who are making use of the handout here, you'll see in the lower right-hand segment, quadrant, you have the four sections of the Shulchan Aruch, which are really the Arba Turim, Or HaChaim, Yoredea, Even HaEzer, and Choshen Mishpat. So those are the four pillars, the four columns that collectively comprise the entirety of Jewish law, which is pertinent in the current era and which is pertinent in the diaspora. So the Tur, Rav Yaakov Bal HaTurim, did not include the laws which are specific to the land of Israel, nor did he include the laws which are only applicable in ancient times or in future times, the Beis HaMikdash and that sort of thing. The Rambam is more comprehensive in that regard. The Tur focuses a bit more narrowly, although there is still very great breadth in his purview, on those areas of Jewish life which are applicable nowadays as well. I say Jewish life, although he also deals extensively with civil law, as you can see in Choshen Mishpah, which is the lower right-hand corner of the page. Laws of witnesses, judges, loans, overreaching, creditor and debtor, lost property, partnerships and agents, sales, inheritance, gifts. Many of those subjects, of course, are applicable to civil law in any society, and of course represent an important part of Jewish law as well. So the Beis Yosef undertook to write this extensive commentary. It was a project that occupied him for the next 20 years. And after he finished it, it took him another 12 years to edit it. So it was really a labor of not just of love, but of enormous scholarship, because the Tur, as you can see right here, I've just opened it up at random. What do we have? About 6 or 7 lines in the small box here at the top. And this is the commentary of Rav Yosef Karo in the Beis Yosef, all of this. And really page by page, one finds a very extensive treatment of the Beis Yosef, in the Beis Yosef, in which he provides the Talmudic background for the source of the Tur, but more than just citing that the Talmudic passage, pass this around if anyone wants to take a look at it, he also reviews in detail the halachic authorities, the early classic authorities, who weigh in on the subject, whether supporting the Tur, serving as a basis of the Tur, possibly disagreeing with the Tur, when the Tur himself quotes more than one opinion. So again, the Beis Yosef will explain who are those opinions and give the extensive background. And he frequently, although not always, will also indicate which is his preferred view. But the very comprehensiveness of it was also, in a way, a kind of limitation as well. Because think to yourself, which scholar has the capacity, has the time and the memory and the proficiency to study the Beis Yosef at length, to recall it all and to apply it in a halachic practical vein? Not too many people. I'm going to return to that problem shortly, because Rav Yosef Karo himself sought to remedy that situation. So just continuing in the main text, if you're on the left-hand column, it is a commentary on the Arba Tumah of Yaakov ben Harosh. As we said, it took him 20 years to complete, and then 12 years of editing. What's interesting is that it was a bit controversial when it came out. There's a legend found in the Chida, my friend from last year, for those who come to Kesher regularly. So the Chida wrote a famous book called Shem HaGedolim, which is a series of biographical sketches of many, many great rabbis who lived before him, as well as some of his contemporaries as well. And he relates the following story or legend, that Rav Mahari ben Lev, who was the great rabbi in Constantinople, did not favor using the Beis Yosef as a commentary on the Torah, because he felt that the students would rely on the Beis Yosef and would not acquire the proficiency in the Talmud that they really need. The Beis Yosef made it too easy. So he would not allow his students, did not encourage his students to make use of the Beis Yosef. And his system was that he had a large audience of Talmidim, very learned disciples, who were expert in different tractates of the Talmud. And when they would get to a passage in the Torah, so he would call on that student who was expert in that particular tractate and say, tell us the background to this statement in the Torah. You know, recite by heart or share with all of us what the Talmud says, which Talmudic passage this is based upon. And he himself, of course, was expert in the entire Talmud. So if that particular student was absent or a bit forgetful, the rabbi would fill it in. According to the story that Chidar relates, on one occasion they got to a certain passage in the Torah, and the rabbi himself wasn't quite sure where it was from. So he said, who knows which of the experts in the various tractates of the Talmud can identify where this is from? Nobody quite knew. And he himself also couldn't remember. So he said, you know what? Get out the Beit Yosef, let's take a look there. Anyway, they looked it up, and there it was, providing the background, the Talmudic source. And the rabbi saw this as a sign from heaven that actually the Beit Yosef was serving a very valuable role, even in that generation. And from that time onward, they began to make use of the Beit Yosef. But whether the story is actually factual or there's some, embellishment to it, it reflects the esteem and the respect and the popularity which the Beit Yosef quickly achieved. I want to talk a little bit now, before we return further to consider his other important writings. I want to talk about his character. Rav Yosef Karo, what kind of person was he? Very interesting. He lived in the Ottoman Empire. We mentioned he lived in Nikopol in Bulgaria, he lived in Constantinople, Adrianople as well, which is also called Hadrianopolis, which is today Edirne in Turkey. And he wanted to make his way to the land of Israel. Actually, I'll just tell you that he was sort of urged to go to Eretz Israel by a Magid. But before I tell you about the Magid, I want to tell you who he met in Salonika. Who came with us to Salonika? Nobody. Everybody else missed out. Salonika was a great Jewish city for hundreds of years. And there were many, many scholars, sages, Kabbalists, and many fascinating and great people. And Rav Yosef Karo lived there for several years as well. And there he met a man called Shlomo Molcho. We met a descendant of his, or at least of that family, who is a woman who's a professor of Jewish history, actually, and she taught us a bit, and we taught her a bit. So in any case, that was that. So her name was Molcho. But this Shlomo Molcho was descended from Aranos, crypto-Jews, and he was about Teshuvah. He cast off the status of Christianity, and he rediscovered Judaism. He became a great Kabbalistic, profound thinker and a kind of wonder worker. And he predicted a flood, and he predicted an earthquake, after which his renown was vast. Anyway, he decided, under the influence of a certain other person called David Rubeini, that he's Mashiach. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work out that way. When he got to meet the Pope or the Emperor had him, the Pope threw him out, and the Emperor had him burned at the stake, basically. And that's what happened to him. But along the way, he greatly inspired Rav Yosef Karo. Rav Yosef Karo, as a young man, the spirituality and the Kabbalistic fervor and the messianic expectation that burns so brightly in the heart of this Shlomo Molcho greatly inspired Rav Yosef Karo, and he decided he wants to go, together with as many others did as well, to Eretz Israel. And they made their way, he and others in his circle before him and after him made their way to the town that we mentioned already, where he lived for the last about 4 decades of his life, in Tzfat. You can visit Tzfat today. As I said, probably many of us have been to Tzfat. It's also a wonderful artist quarter there, very spiritual, very special place. Tzfat, anyone who has not had the chance to visit there, please put it on your itinerary. Today, Tzfat is a small town, but it's a bustling town. Near Tzfat is a little town called Meron, and if anyone has heard of Meron, and probably you have heard of Meron, it's because you know that's where Rav Shimon Bar Yochai is buried. But originally, the Jews went to Tzfat, I don't mean originally in antiquity, but originally in medieval times, they went to Tzfat because they wanted to be near Meron. They wanted to be near the burial site of Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, of course the traditional author of the Zohar, and I say they, and I refer specifically to the Spanish emigres, the Spanish exiles. We spoke last week when we did Rav Isaac Abarbanel, how they were traumatized by the expulsion from Spain. Of all of the expulsions in Jewish history, since the great expulsion from Churban Yerushalayim until modern times, the most traumatic expulsion of all was the one from Spain in 1492. They were completely traumatized by it. I told you they turned their backs on philosophy to a great extent, and they tended to embrace Kabbalah instead. It was Kabbalah ma'asit also, practical Kabbalah, Kabbalah for a purpose, the purpose being to precipitate the Advent. They felt that their trauma of the exile from Spain could only be understood in terms of a divine plan for the redemption of the Jewish people and the redemption of all mankind. And that is the main reason why these Spanish emigres, they made their way one by one, and it wasn't en masse, because it was sort of the spiritual seekers who made their way to Tzfat. And in that generation, we have the most remarkable group of people at one time. And we'll speak more about that when we talk about the Ari in a couple of weeks' time as well. In fact, Yosef Karo, he was already a mature, renowned scholar when he arrived in Tzfat, and he immediately was appointed to a position in the Beit of Rav Yaakov Beit Rav. Rav Yaakov Beit Rav was the Av Beit Din. What's interesting though, we're kind of a bit discursive here in our approach, but Rav Yaakov Beit Rav had been the rabbi in Egypt. When Rav Yosef Karo was in Salonika, and he decided he wants to go to Eretz Israel, he went via Egypt. I don't think it was just like happenstance. I'm sure there was a good reason for it. I don't think he just got on the wrong boat accidentally. Could be they didn't have boats that were going from Salonika to Jaffa or to Akko in the ancient ports. But possibly he went to Egypt where there was a strong Jewish community. In any case, he met Rav Yaakov Beit Rav there. Subsequently, Rav Yaakov Beit Rav moved to Tzfat, became the Av Beit Din in Tzfat, and Rav Yosef Karo was on his Beit Din at that time as well. But just to go back to Shlomo Malcho, who inspired Rav Yosef Karo, he inspired him to move to Eretz Israel, and he also inspired him, and this sounds strange to us, or at least to me, but he inspired him to crave the death of a martyr. And when he heard that Rav Shlomo Malcho died at the stake, he wanted to also die in a similar way al Kiddush Hashem. It wasn't a death wish, but it was a kind of aspiration that he should be zoche, he should merit to be among those who not only in their lives but even in their death sanctify the name of Hashem. And this takes us to the Magid of Rav Yosef Karo. Maran Bet Yosef had a Magid. A Magid is a preacher, but this wasn't just a regular preacher, this was a heavenly emissary. He kept a diary of the revelations that were given to him through a heavenly emissary whom he called the Magid. And when he would sleep, or at other times when he would meditate, he would have like a vision or a kind of communication from this Magid, and he would write down afterwards. This book has been published. It's called Magid Meisharim. It was only published about 200 years after his death. It was probably never intended for publication at all. Private notes. Some of them are quite revealing. Some of them are quite cryptic. Some of them also cast Rav Yosef Karo, I won't say in an unfavorable light, but reflect his aspirations that were unfulfilled, that were unrealized. This Magid was called the Mishnah. The Mishnah. And in other words, he identified himself as the Mishnah, and Mishnah meaning Torah Shebal Peh. And he would ask this heavenly, communicator questions, and he would receive the answers, and he would write them down. A very interesting, almost unique book called Magid Mishram. And there we have the promise or the suggestion that yes, he will merit to die al Kiddush Hashem, which ultimately turned out not to be the case for reasons which we cannot know for sure. So this was part of the spiritual life, the inner life of Rabbi Yosef Karo. This Magid would exhort him to acts of piety, to acts of asceticism. If he would drink wine and then he would drink another cup of wine, so the Magid would say, why do you need another cup of wine? One cup of wine is enough. These kinds of ascetic exhortations. So the Magid was an inner voice of prompting him to greater and higher, loftier acts of piety. Just because we're talking briefly about some of the lesser known books of Rav Yosef Karo, he also published, he didn't publish in his lifetime, again it was about 200 years after his death, a book called Avkat Rochel. Avkat Rochel is the collection of the responsa of Rav Yosef Karo. And there we have letters that were written to him by great rabbis around the world, including the Ramah. The Ramah himself wrote Rav Yosef Karo a question. Rav Yosef Karo responded. We'll talk a lot more about the Ramah next week. There's also a tshuva addressed to the divine, the Mekubal Yitzchak Luria, which is the Ari. Fascinating that the Ari asked him a question about business ethics, we could say, and he responded to that question as well. So the Avkat Rochel is a kind of eclectic collection of his responsa. But whereas other great rabbis, their halachic contributions lie primarily in their responsa, but in the case of Rav Yosef Karo, he is best known, of course, as the author of the Shulchan Aruch. So let's just proceed a little bit further in our review of this text you have in front of you, and we'll talk as we go along about the Shulchan Aruch as well. So there's a reference here to the Kabbalist of Shlomo Malcho and an ascetic lifestyle of fasting and pious devotion to God. In 1530, it was really 1536, he moved via Egypt, as you mentioned, to Tzfat, where he was appointed as a member of the rabbinic court of Rav Yaakov Beirav. He established a yeshiva, counting among his students the great Rabbi Moshe Alshich and the illustrious Kabbalist Rav Moshe Cordovero. Now, what the author of this little short sketch does not elaborate upon is a fascinating chapter in the life of Rav Yosef Karo about Chidush HaSmicha, the reinstitution of the concept of smicha. Smicha means ordination. Now, what we call smicha today is just a term which we utilize as a kind of shorthand to indicate that a person has studied and gained proficiency in certain areas of halacha and has been ordained with the authority to render halachic decisions, or maybe to teach or to serve as a rabbi. This is what we call colloquially smicha. And it's a bit like a bachelor's degree from university. You know, you can have from a very distinguished university, you can have from Slippery Rock, like we call it in America, or something like that. You know, you could get from Harvard, or you could get from a local community college. So both times you write BA after your name, but you know, it's not exactly the same for one who is among the cognoscenti, shall we say. Okay, that is smicha as it exists today. But the term smicha is only a borrowed usage, because the original smicha was an ordination that was transmitted from one generation to the next, from teacher to disciple, and from generation to generation, stretching back to antiquity, stretching back to the Nevi'im, stretching back ultimately to Moshe, who gave smicha to Yehoshua. And that institution of smicha empowered the one who was ordained to render judgment in certain areas of halacha that a person without smicha cannot render those judgments. In particular, when we talk about the forms of punishments that the courts would hand down, like the punishment of death penalty, which was very rare, as I think is well known, it was an extreme rarity, but it was a possibility at least. But only smuchim, only dayanim who have smicha have the authority to do that. Not only that, but even penalties. I don't want to get too technical, but suffice to say that the institution of smicha existed in ancient times, and it expired around the time of the Gemara. In Mishnah times they had smuchim. In already Talmudic times, in the days of the Gemara, already no longer existed. They can only give smicha in Eretz Yisrael, and it can only be given by someone who had smicha. Now, you say, well, how can you reinstitute such a thing hundreds and hundreds of years later? So this Rabbi Yaakov Beirav had an idea. He wanted to reinstitute the smicha because the Rambam writes in the laws of the Sanhedrin, in chapter 4, halacha 11, the Rambam says that Nirli Hadvarim, it seems to me that if all of the sages in Eretz Israel agreed to give smicha to a certain person, and since they are all the sages in the land of Israel, and they all agree that a certain rabbi is worthy of smicha, then that rabbi can in turn give smicha to others as well. And it's a way of reinstituting the ancient phenomenon of smicha. Now, this was also part of the messianic urge, because it was like a kind of chadesh yameinu kekedem, renew our days as of old. The attempt to recover some of the ancient glory in anticipation of the restoration of the Jewish people to their land with the coming of Mashiach. Not only that, but again, I don't want to get too technical, but the smuchim are necessary in order to administer lashes. Now, the courts would administer lashes of a rabbinic nature in order to punish a person, in order to serve as an incentive or as a warning to others, an incentive not to commit criminal acts. But that was just a kind of rabbinic institution. The real lashes, the real malkos could only be administered, could only be handed down as a ruling by a Beit Din of smuchim. So you say, yeah, who needs lashes anyway though? The less lashes, the better. Don't forget that those Spanish emigres, some of them, maybe quite a few of them, were balei teshuva, not the way we use the term colloquially today, but those who had kissed the cross, those who submitted to baptism to save their homes and their businesses and for their own comfort rather than go into exile. And some of them, or their children or their grandchildren, regretted it deeply and profoundly and yearned for a process of teshuva, of atonement. They yearned for a means of purification, for a means of rectification, and therefore they craved those lashes which they felt would be their expiation to expiate their sin. Remember, those who were caught by the church Judaizing were burned at the stake. So compared to being burned at the stake, lashes is not such a bad thing. I don't know, if you want to think of it in those terms. I'm not saying any of us would look forward to such an experience. But that was the case. But in order to, and by the way, the lashes were not necessarily extremely painful. They may be only just symbolic lashes. It doesn't say it has to be, exceedingly painful. But even the symbolic lashes are only effective if they are decreed by the Beit Din of smuchim. And this is probably the underlying motivation. So the Rambam says, Nirin li hadvar, it would appear to me, this is his novelty. This is not found in the Talmud. The Talmud doesn't provide for the possibility of reinstating and somehow reviving the smicha system. But then the Rambam concludes with the words, V'hadavar tzarich hechra. The matter still needs further study, needs further adjudication. But the Rambam has that proposal. Rav Yaakov Beirav said, let's follow what the Rambam says. We'll get all the rabbis in the land of Israel together. Now the problem was, they forgot about an important town a bit south of Tzfat. What town is that?
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem, yeah. The rabbis in Jerusalem didn't like the idea that the rabbis in Tzfat said, well, we're all the important rabbis in Israel, we agree we're going to do it. They thought this was a great affront to their authority and their dignity, and a great controversy ensued. And although Rav Yaakov ben Rav gave smicha to Rav Yosef Karo, Rav Yosef Karo gave smicha to Rav Moshe Al-Sheikh and to others, but it never went further than that. The interesting thing is that here in the Rambam, I told you the Kesef Mishnah is written by Rav Yosef Karo. It's got a comment on the Rambam. He says about 3 or 4 lines on this comment to the Rambam and nothing more. It doesn't say anything about his own role in it. Doesn't say anything about this was enthusiastically taken up, but unfortunately the matter was abandoned. Doesn't say anything about it. In that sense, he has a complete separation of his halachic analysis with his, let's say, historical or personal involvement or personal life in that regard. So,
did he manage to source where it came from?
No, it was really the novel idea of the Rambam. And that's what the Rambam himself says, Nirili Hadvarim, it would appear to me. And he says at the end, and the matter still requires further study. So the critics of the Smicha program said, look, no one else other than the Rambam even has that idea. And even the Rambam himself doesn't have a source for it. And even he himself says it would appear to me. And even he himself says, but I'm not 100% sure the matter requires further adjudication. For that reason and others, the process, as I said, never really gained traction beyond that single generation. Upon the death of Rabbi Yaakov ben Rav, we're just above the middle still of this column, he succeeded him as chief of the rabbinic court of Tzfat, which served as the main Beit Din for worldwide Jewry. Now, of course, in those days, they didn't have airmail, let alone email, didn't have aerograms, they didn't have Pony Express, for those who know what the Pony Express is, Carlos knows what the Pony Express is. They didn't have any of that, so you can imagine that to send a letter from Cairo or from Krakow to Tzfat, how many weeks and months would it take, to communicate and send it back? And if there's any follow-up question, I mean, it was almost unrealistic to even have a further sort of exchange about the subject. We are so used to instant communications with telephone, with email, and that sort of thing. But nevertheless, notwithstanding the difficulties of the communication, Tzfat, the Beit Din in Tzfat, became the leading Beit Din for all of world Jewry. And Rav Yosef Karo, partly because he was blessed with long life, and he published his books, all his books were published in Europe. They didn't have a printing press in Tzfat, and his books were published mostly in Italy. But nevertheless, they quickly spread throughout the Jewish world, as we told the story about his commentary on the Torah. And his own renown, as I keep saying, his saintliness and his mastery of Torah literature and halachic literature meant that he became very, very respected throughout the Jewish world. However, his approach to halacha inevitably reflected the Sephardic tradition. He himself lived all of his life in the Sephardic milieu, and although he was had a full understanding of the classic Ashkenazic authorities, he did not necessarily have, let's say, not so much that he didn't have the respect, but he was not motivated to validate or to seek to justify minhagim, Ashkenazic minhagim, customs. The Ramah, partly that was, as we shall see next week, that was partly his contribution to the Shulchan Aruch. The Beis Yosef says in his introduction that I'm going to decide the halacha in accordance with the majority of 3 opinions. Who are they? Do you remember we spoke about it when we did the tour? Who are the 3 great authorities? Now the Beis Yosef quotes many authorities beyond those 3, but he says most of the time, as a rule of thumb, I'm going to rule according to the majority of the following 3. Who are the 3? Rambam, the Rif, the Rambam, and the Rosh. So the Rif, of course, lived where? Little quiz, where the Rif lived? Rav Yitzhak Alfasi. He lived in Morocco, and then the end of his life in Spain. Sephardi, to the max. The Rambam is Rav Moshe HaSfardi. He lived in Spain, in Egypt, then in Morocco as well. So you've got already inbuilt 2 out of 3 are Sephardi. And the Rosh he lived in Ashkenaz, but in the last 20 years he lived also in among the Sephardim. So you've got a built-in sort of not so much a bias, but the way he's sort of his formula is naturally going to favor the Sephardic authorities. Most of the time, by the way, he follows the Rambam. It's been estimated that about a third of the Shulchan Aruch comes more or less verbatim from the Rambam, from the Mishnah Torah. So the Rav Yosef Karo really saw the Rambam as the dominant authority, and by the way, the Rif and the Rambam usually agree. Most of the time, the Rif and the Rambam are on the same page in any case, and therefore the Beis Yosef tended to follow the Sephardic authorities. Now, what the limitation of the Beis Yosef was that its greatness was also its Achilles heel, and that is its size. It was so comprehensive, it was so voluminous. So he came up with a very good idea, and that is a good idea by the name of the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch means a set table. A set table is elegant, it's inviting, it's organized. You have everything you need on the table. You've got cutlery, you've got crockery, you've got crystal, you've got silver. If there's some food there, all the better. The set table is a metaphor for something which is accessible and inviting and well organized. It's been suggested that he derived the idea, the name Shulchan Aruch, from Rashi at the beginning of Mishpatim. If my boys were here, I would quiz them on it, but the boys are not here, so it's not fair to me to quiz you. So the Rashi says at the beginning of Mishpatim, Ela Mishpatim Asher Tasim Lifneihem. Says Rashi, K'Shulchan Aruch Umuchan Lifnei Ha'adam. Like a set table that is prepared before a person. These are the ordinances, these are the laws that you shall place before them. That's what Rashi says. A certain scholar, I'll mention his name just because it's the right thing to do. I've got a fellow academic here. He's, you're not supposed to quote, to plagiarize. So I'll say it comes from a man called Leo Beck, if you've ever heard of him. So Leo Beck had the suggestion that he says that in his view, the Beit Yosef, when he coined the name Shulchan Aruch, he must have had in mind the verse in Tehillim, the famous Psalm 23. Mizmor LeDavid, Hashem ro'i lo echsar, taroch lefanai shulchan neged sorarai. Taroch lefanai shulchan. Array the table before me. Okay?
Your idea is better.
My idea is better. Okay, thank
I'm
you.
not sure how full his table was.
Yeah, his table wasn't that full. Yeah, in any case, so he called it Shulchan. And what is Shulchan? I haven't told you what it is. It is a condensation and a kind of review, a compression of the Shulchan, of the Beis Yosef, of the conclusions of the Beis Yosef. Now, this is the Shulchan Aruch here. Actually, I have one at home which is about 30% larger. I thought, why should I bring it just to show off with all my annotations in it? I got one here at Cashier, and this is actually, in a way, a nicer one. It's a clearer print. That's why it's not as large, because it doesn't have to be as large. The print is clearer, because this was typeset anew with modern technology. My Shulchan Aruch is I didn't buy it in antiquity. I only bought it about, I think Ruthie bought it for me as a gift. I bought it about 35 years ago. But it was a reprint from Vilna, probably from 100 years ago, whereas this is all typeset anew. Now, I just opened it up at random. You can see at the top of the page here, okay, this actually, the Rashi script is the Ramah even. The Shulchan Aruch is like 3 lines, and you can just see, even at the distance, wherever you're sitting, you can see, just looking at the page, all of these commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. But the Shulchan Aruch itself is very short. It's very short. Here's a page. A big folio page like this, the Shulchan Aruch is about 3 lines, short lines in the middle of the page. So compared to the tour that we were passing around on the Beis Yosef, which is 10 volumes of small print, the Shulchan Aruch itself is very short. In fact, it was designed to be reviewed every month. The whole Shulchan Aruch is divided into 30 days, and a mature scholar can review the whole Shulchan Aruch, by which I mean the 4 Arba Turim of the Shulchan Aruch. And by the way, this is about 10 volumes right over here. about 10 or maybe 12 volumes. One can review the Shulchan Aruch itself every 30 days. That was the idea of Rav Yosef Karo. The brevity of it, the clarity of it made it immediately very popular. But by the same token, after a while people said, you know what? It's brilliant, it's so useful, and it remains to this very day the basis of Jewish law. But it's too brief. There's no explanation. There's no recognition of dissenting views. There's no background. And that is why all of the commentaries over time grew up around it. Someone once likened this to an accordion. An accordion, in order to play an accordion, you need to bring it out and bring it in, bring it out again. So you have a similar thing where the Talmud is vast. So the Rif came along and he condensed it. Then the Rif was considered to be too brief, or the Rambam, condensed it. And then the commentaries grew around the Rambam, and then the Tur, and then the commentaries around the Tur, and then the Shulchan Aruch compressed it, the commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. And there are many efforts since the Shulchan Aruch, again, to compress it, like the Chachmas Adam, like the Chaye Adam, like the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch itself. Kitzur Shulchan Aruch remains very popular. It was written about 150 years ago. This is the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, and this is Katzar, this is short. And and actually there are commentaries on the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch as well, but it is useful enough just on its own as a useful volume, Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. But it's only brief. It doesn't have everything of the main Shulchan Aruch. Time is nearly up, so let's just finish the outline here. We've got, so we're about halfway through this column. Through the monumental books, he became the acknowledged preeminent Torah authority in the world, a reputation that is not waned with the passage of time. In his book, Beit Yosef, he compiles all the variant views on each halacha, and renders a decision as to which opinion is to be authoritative law, and is printed alongside the text, etc. Given issue, the Rif, the Rambam, and the Rush, we spoke about that. If they disagree, the halacha is decided according to the majority opinion. His rulings reflect his Sephardi background and that they favor Sephardi customs over Ashkenazi practices. After the completion of the Beit Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote the Shulchan Aruch, as its title implies, the set table. All the Jewish laws and customs relevant to the present time in clear and concise Hebrew, arranged systematically according to topics. Okay, you can really read the rest of that at your leisure. Just the very last part of it. Among Rav Yosef Karo's other works is Kesef Mishnah, which we spoke about, by clearly mentioning the source on which his decision is found. Yosef Karo has given halacha a solid foundation. His work has stood the test of time. Indeed, the Shulchan Aruch continues to be the proverbial guide to all facets of Jewish living. The 4 volumes, the 4, sections of the Shulchan Aruch are even part of Jewish parlance. So much so that you may have heard the expression the 5th Shulchan Aruch. What is the 5th Shulchan Aruch? It's a slightly tongue-in-cheek designation. It's not meant sarcastically, but it's a bit tongue-in-cheek. The 5th Shulchan Aruch is common sense. You said that a rabbi has to be expert not only in the 4 columns of the Shulchan Aruch, but in the 5th Shulchan Aruch as well, which is maybe insight, human understanding, intuition, common sense, and that sort of thing. As it's not meant sarcastically, but the reason I mentioned that little well-known quip is that the idea of the Shulchan Aruch remains the catchword, the sort of shorthand for the entirety of practical Jewish law to be observed nowadays. Of course, in order to really be a rabbi, you have to have the sense as well and the ability to apply the laws of the Shulchan Aruch. I'd like to mention an excellent article called the Shulchan Aruch Enduring Code of Jewish Law. For one who is interested in learning more about the Shulchan Aruch and about the Ramah as well, and we'll speak about Ramah next week, this is an excellent article by Isidor Tursky. Isidor Tursky was, the late Isidor Tursky was the chairman of the Jewish Studies Department at Harvard University. He was the Tolner Rebbe. He was also a son-in-law of Rav Yosef Ber Soloveitchik, a most remarkable combination, actually. He wrote this article in 1967, it appeared. And you can find it, you can, Just about done. I'm competing with myself. For those who are sleeping the first time around, you can hear it the second time. Yeah, you can find it online if you like. I just look. I photocopied this when I was in graduate school in the last century before the internet era. But I did check yesterday, and it is available actually online if you want to find the Shulchan Aruch Enduring Code of Jewish Law by Isidore Tursky. It's not that long. It's about 15 pages, maybe less. It's a very excellent article, learned article on the Shulchan Aruch and its impact. Just see if there's anything else. Yeah, perhaps we'll end with one last little anecdote. Yosef Karo said that he was the leading Torah authority of the generation. We'll speak next week about his relationship with Rav Moshe Isserles, but he lived to old age, and his renown spread throughout the Jewish world. But especially in Tzfat, in his hometown, so his word was absolute law, and the influence of Yosef Karo in Tzfat endures even to this day. Some years ago, Rav Moshe Shapiro, you may have heard of that name. He died only a couple of years ago. I knew him very well. I learned a lot from Rav Moshe Shapiro. I consider myself a Talmud of Rav Moshe Shapiro. And a friend of mine told me that he heard from Rav Moshe Shapiro, this goes back maybe 25, 30 years, that he, the great rabbi, visited Tzfat in the summertime for Ben Hazmanim. And it was during the Shemitah year. And regarding the laws of Shemitah, there is a well-known disagreement between Rav Yosef Karo, the Beis Yosef, who was like the rabbi of the land of Israel and whose word was law, especially with regard to the practices in the land of Israel for centuries. And another great rabbi who lived much, much after him, but nevertheless a very great rabbi who reserved the right to analyze the circumstances and the halachic parameters of his own accord, as the Chazon Ish. And Chazon Ish, who died in 1954, he had a certain chumrah, a certain stringency. Rav Yosef Karo, his view carried the day for centuries, and the old Yishuv also followed the view of Rav Yosef Karo regarding a certain law relating to Shemitah. The details are not important. Chazon Ish felt that was a leniency which one should not rely upon, and outside of Yerushalayim, in many places, they followed the stringency of the Chazon Ish. In Yerushalayim, because that was the minhag already for generations, they followed the lenient view of Rav Yosef Karo. So Rav Moshe Shapiro, that's the background. Rav Moshe Shapiro went to Tzfat, and during the Shemitah year, and he came back, he said, I have a heavy heart. He said, I saw in Tzfat, they had posters that you can buy Shemitah produce which adheres to the stringency of Chazon Ish. And he said, I think this is a terrible affront to the authority and the dignity of Rav Yosef Karo in his own hometown. Okay, it's true, he died 400 years ago, but nevertheless, in his own hometown, that you're touting that you are following the chumrah of the Chazon Ish. If you want to do chumrah of the Chazon Ish someplace else, okay, but in Tzfat, or if you do it, at least be quiet about it. Don't openly say, we are going to do better than the Beis Yosef, we are going to follow the chumrah of the Chazon Ish. So, as I said, he was, not only was he a great person in his time, but through the Beis Yosef, through the Kesef Mishnah, and most of all through the Shulchan Aruch, he remains the definitive authority, the basis for all Jewish life and Jewish jurisprudence and practice, even until today.
I'm wondering, because of its length, how often studied the Beit Yosef is nowadays?
That's a good question. The answer is that if a person wants to get smicha, and he wants to study a subject matter thoroughly, then he definitely will study the Beit Yosef as well. Because, that's the reason that I said, the Shulchan Aruch is very brief, and even though you have all the commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, but they, in a way, take the Shulchan Aruch forward. But what about the basis for his rulings? So for that, you need to see the Beis Yosef. So certainly the Shulchan Aruch is much more widely studied today than the Beis Yosef. We'll talk again. I've saved it for next week because we're going to return to talk more about the Shulchan Aruch next week when we speak about Ramah. But here you have the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah is 6 volumes, normally published in 6 volumes, only on Orach Chaim. But it's based on the Shulchan Aruch, not based on the Torah. So you're quite right in saying that most of the contemporary commentaries that are written, especially those that are even more recent, they all base themselves on the Shulchan Aruch. They don't necessarily go back to the sort of foundations of the Beis Yosef. But a person who wants to have a thorough understanding of the subject definitely needs to learn the Beis Yosef as well. You know, if a person is researching a particular subject, then he would quote the Beit Yosef. We did it ourselves a few weeks ago. We had a shir here at Kesher about a certain subject, and we mentioned the Beit Yosef and the Darchei Moshe on the Torah as well. So any thorough study of any of these halakhic subjects would definitely involve still the Beit Yosef, but the Shulchan Aruch is much more popular because of its brevity and remains, as I said, the definitive, not necessarily the last word, but it is the basis, it's the foundation, and it's the operative foundation, even to this day, for Jewish practice. Thank you very much.
Yeah. What's the main differences between Beit Yosef and Mishnah Torah?
So the Beit Yosef...
sorry, not Mishnah Torah, Mishnah Torah.
Mishnah Torah. Okay, so the Beit Yosef is a commentary on the Torah. The Torah was written by Rav Yaakov ben Harash, and he died in 1340, I think, if I remember from last year.
Well, the Torah is a commentary on
No, the Torah is an original word. The Torah is an original word, which takes into account the Mishnah Torah and many other authorities as well. So the Mishnah Torah of the Rambam is a work unto itself. Kesef Mishnah is a commentary on the Mishnah Torah. There are many other classic commentaries on the Mishnah Torah. The Torah is a separate independent work, which for certain reasons, well, I don't want to say it's more popular than the Mishnah Torah, but it was a very, and remains a very valuable source in its own right alongside the Mishnah Torah. And it was so popular, the Torah, that Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote this extensive commentary, Beis Yosef, on the Torah, even though he had already written a commentary on the Mishnah Torah, which he subsequently published as a separate endeavor. Really, the Kesef Mishnah is not so widely studied as a halachic source in its own right. The Kesef Mishnah is more of a commentary on the Mishnah Torah, whereas the Beis Yosef is much more extensive. So Rav Yosef Karo, let's say, implanted or displayed his most extensive halachic erudition into this commentary on the Torah. But because it was so extensive, he found it worthwhile to compress it much further in the Shulchan Aruch.
So the Shulchan Aruch is much more extensive than the Mishnah Torah. No?
Not really.
I'm trying to in my mind, because Rambam is considered one of the greatest halakhics of all time.
Absolutely.
So I'm trying to, in my mind, get to grips with this Shulchan Aruch, which is also considered, you say, to this day, trying to get in my mind the different, the key differences between the two.
So the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam was in some ways a maverick, even though his renown and his prestige is such that he's absolutely fundamental to the development of halacha.
Right.
But nevertheless, he was a maverick in that he does not provide the sources for his rulings. He doesn't refer to or even acknowledge other dissenting opinions. He just says his opinion and this is the law. That's the approach of the Rambam. The Mishnah Torah has certain other features, some philosophy in it, it's very comprehensive, it has certain other features and certain other limitations. So Rav Yaakov Baal HaTurim decided to write a separate work, separate in the sense that he draws on the Rambam, but he also draws on many other authorities who disagree with the Rambam. He provides a lot more background than the Rambam does. So the Rambam, the Mishnah Torah, and the Torah were two coexisting important sources of halachic opinion. The Rambam, although very, very venerated and renowned, etc., but he often was a maverick. His opinions were frequently difficult to understand where he gets it from. Or there would be two opinions in the Talmud, and the Rambam would follow one view, even though that view seems to be disputed by the Talmud itself, which is why so many commentaries grew up around the Rambam to explain it, etc. But it has its limitations for that reason. Certain other things as well. The Rambam, because he was a philosopher, so many people objected to his philosophical interests, and they went so far as to question his reliability as a halachic authority, because he's a philosopher who follows the Greeks and all of that. So even though the Rambam's reputation has emerged intact, but he was bruised, I don't mean personally, even though there are personal attacks on him as well, but the Mishnah Torah therefore was respected, but regarded as, generally speaking, regarded as not sufficient in its own right.
And therefore, as a basis for Jewish law, not a basis, the pinnacle of Jewish law, for want of a better word, the Shulchan Aruch is regarded as higher, dare one say, than the Mishnah Torah.
That's correct. Because even though I said that he follows the Mishnah Torah very frequently, it's estimated that a third of the Shulchan Aruch comes verbatim from the Mishnah Torah. So it's not that he said, I'm going to supersede the Rambam.
No, I understand.
But on the other hand, if we say a third of it comes, it means 2/3 of it doesn't come from the Mishnah Torah. 2/3 of it come from other sources.
Surely he validated the Mishnah Torah because he sourced everything.
Yes.
So presumably post his works, whether it be the Beit Yosef or the Kesef Mishnah, once he'd achieved sourcing everything from the Rambam, then a lot of that critique gone.
It's true.
Because it's all been verified.
Yeah, but there are other factors. Firstly, the Rambam was sort of received his endorsement before the Beit Yosef as well, for a variety of reasons. But also, philosophy was no longer in vogue so much, so it wasn't so controversial anymore. The Rambam's philosophy, and also his reputation had already withstood the test of time. So it's not like the Beit Yosef rehabilitated the Rambam, even though what you say, there is some truth to what you say, Anthony, that the Beit Yosef himself, he was holy, he was devout, he was a Kabbalist, he was an ascetic, he was saintly, he lived a very long life, he was very productive. So it's true that his endorsement of the Rambam, if you could think of it in those terms, was useful for the Rambam's reputation. But the Rambam did not need the endorsement of the Beit Yosef, but it so happens that the Shulchan Aruch is built largely on the foundation of the Mishnah Torah.
Now, I'm sorry, another question, and that is, Rambam, with his greatness, surely appreciated, even though you say he was a maverick, but surely with his immense greatness, knew the great importance of quoting one's sources when one makes a statement.
Yeah, okay.
And so it is very, 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 very surprising, to say the least, that the whole of the Mishnah Torah, basically, is written without any sources. How did he expect it to be accepted?
We spoke about the Rambam in the summer term.
On the Kesher Chapter.
It's a cornerstone. If you make any statement today, you've got to quote your source.
You're right.
I
I would suggest that, like Ruthie said, you can view it on our Kesher channel. You can view our lecture on the Rambam, and I quoted there what the Rambam writes in his introduction to the Mishnah Torah. And he said that I've called my book Mishnah Torah because
You made a very good point about he validated resources, so he was confirming that he agreed, exactly, he confirmed what Rambam wrote.
Very good point. No, look, Rabbi, I don't want to take up
From
more of your
recollection,
time.
didn't you mention that there was a question of who the audience was for the Mishnah Torah when he first wrote it? Was it for his local?
That relation to that he didn't give his sources.
no, the reason that I'm trying to find.
He actually he explained this to some extent.
He explained why he's not including his sources. and this is part of why the Rambam was criticized.
And as you said, called a maverick.
He was criticized because he didn't quote his sources, and he said, I'm quoting my book Mishnah Torah because a person can study the Torah of Moshe, and he can study my book. He doesn't need anything else in between. That's called the Mishnah Torah, second Torah. You've got the Torah, that one here. You've got the Torah scroll, and you've got my book, and that's all you need.
Well, that is a maverick.
I thought you explained
That
this.
is a maverick's
No, but
position.
in that shir, I'm pretty sure you said that there's a possibility that he wasn't speaking to the wider Jewish world. He was speaking to his local community, who maybe had a certain amount of time at their disposal. And he's saying, if you want to just kind of, you've only got a limited amount of time, do this.
All you need to do is
He's
mime.
not saying for the Torah.
That's
All you need is mime.
Yeah,
No, but
he's
what
not
was
saying that.
available? Where was the print, how much was available in print at that time?
Well, nothing was available in print.
Exactly.
Nothing in its
So-
name.
So what was he
Before the
gonna do,
printing
go to the
press.
library and get other things?
Maybe
No,
there's
but
a
what
context
he said-
for that. There's a
what
context
he-
for that.
What he meant was, again, he was criticized as trying to supersede the Talmud itself. That's what I always criticized. As if say, you don't need the Talmud, you don't need the Talmud anymore, you just need me. What he meant, I'm sure, was like Anthony is saying, that for someone who doesn't have the time or the proficiency or the capacity to recall or the ability to clarify what is the conclusion of the Talmudic discussion,
Or
which of course
access
a
to
lot
the
of people,
Sefer.
this is helpful.
Also access to the access.
Material.
Yeah, may not have access to it as well. So therefore, but you know, people call, for a long time, people did not call the Mishnah Torah by that name. They called it Yad HaChazakah, the Yad HaChazakah. And the Rambam himself says you can call it Yad HaChazakah because it has 14 volumes, and that's Gematria Yad. Yad HaChazakah Asher Asa Moshe Le'nei Yisrael. My name is Moshe ben Maimon. So this you can call Yad HaChazakah. So people say, yeah, that's what we call it. We're going to call it Yad HaChazakah because the real name Mishnah Torah is too arrogant. It's too presumptuous.
Yeah.
The name Mishnah Torah.
Sure.
The other reason he doesn't quote his sources is that he writes elsewhere that some people may not like my sources. They may not like the person that I'm quoting. So therefore he says, Kabel et ha'emet mimisha amara.
Well,
Accept the truth from whoever says it. And they said, even if the source is someone that you may not regard in great eminence, but if what he has to say is valuable, don't pay attention to who says it. And that's how he justifies not quoting his sources. He says, like, basically, take it from me. You know, don't.
So how did Yosef Karo get Rabbi Yosef Karo get all his sources?
Yeah,
They're
exactly.
some obscure people.
Good
Well,
question.
he went to the Talmud. How did
Well,
Yosef Karo validate it
yeah.
all if there was sometimes some potentially obscure sources?
Well, it's a good question.
Mm.
The printing press was already very active in his day. It had only been invented. I mean, he was born in 1488. The first Hebrew book ever printed was in 1475, Rashi's commentary on the Torah. But once they got started, they churned out a lot of books. And the Beit Yosef, he must have had a photographic memory, and whatever he read, he must have not only understood but committed to memory. And he is able to quote very, very widely. Of course, he didn't have access to as many books as we do, or even Chida had access to much more books. But nevertheless, the classic sources he had at his fingertips.
now I'm sorry, I've got another question, and that is the Shulchan Aruch itself, does it have a very detailed index?
No.
No.
There are chapter headings, but there's no index.
Not very detailed.
No.
Nobody has done that.
It has been done.
It has been done.
Yeah, it has been done.
No, I
yeah,
just,
we have some, but requires still quite a lot of erudition to,
No,
to
sure,
find,
yes.
to know what you're looking for and to
Obviously.
find it. Okay, I think we'll wrap it up.
Thank you very
to
much.
everyone for joining us. Thank you to Yaakov for your video talents. Just looking for this passage.